very glad to be here today. Thanks especially to John for extending the invitation, and thanks all of you for coming out on the day where I don't think we're going to reach 10 degrees. So I've distributed a list of texts, which hopefully Andrea can pass around. I'll be referring to a handful of these in the course of my talk. So the project I'm presenting today is very far from finished. I've been doing the reading of this project in Tibetan over the last 4 years. And just in the next couple of months, I hope to turn my attention more towards writing the book that will hopefully come out of this. So this means that the work is very much still in progress. I don't have all my conclusions figured out yet, which means that this is an ideal time to meet with a group like you all and get some feedback. So I honestly look forward to your questions, your concerns, your suggestions. That could seriously impact the direction that this book finally takes. My presentation today is going to be split into 6 parts. First, I will address the basic issue that I believe calls this research into being. Second, I'll be introducing the sort of specific topic of my research, which is long-term meditative retreat in Tibet. Third, I will briefly discuss the sources that I'm using for this project. Fourth will be the main part of my presentation, in which I walk us through my reading of a few different texts on this particular issue that I'm focusing on today, which is the issue of food. Fifth, I'll offer a couple of conclusions and observations. And then lastly, if there's time, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about my next project, which brings the study of contemporary retreat into the current moment. So, part 1, the issue. We are living in a contemplative moment. Buddhist meditation is more popular and known by more people around the world than it ever has been at any moment in its 2,500 plus year history. This is remarkable. Something that was just 20 or 30 years ago was exotic and difficult to access for many Westerners is now accessible to any one of us at any time. Get the Headspace app, have it in your pocket, and learn about meditation whenever you want. Also very significant is the way that meditation instruction has spilled over and is now associated with institutions, the likes of which it was never associated with throughout its entire history. Now meditation in the West is being taught in elementary schools, in hospitals, at public universities, and so on. This is very different from traditional contexts where meditation was the purview specifically of monasteries. So all of these things are interesting things for us to observe and consider as scholars of Buddhism. While this momentum behind meditation continues to grow, I think that in our field, there's actually been very little attention to one very important issue, which is how the specific cultures of Buddhist meditation in the Buddhist world and now around the rest of the world, how those specific cultures of meditation differ from one another, and how those cultures of meditation actually affect the question of what meditation is. How do the ideas, norms, procedures, and relationships that contextualize meditative practice affect its meanings and perhaps also its outcomes? Current trends in mindfulness and contemplative studies rest upon what I would characterize as an instrumentalist understanding of what meditation is. This entails the erasure of the social, historical, and even the religious context in which meditative practices have traditionally been taken. My project asks what happens when we forego the quantifiable and instead try and understand meditation in a qualitative manner through an examination of the specific and variable contexts in which it has been performed. Part 2. What I've chosen to pursue in this project is a study of the culture of meditation in Tibet specifically. And throughout the 1,000-year history of meditation in Tibet, meditation has been practiced first and foremost in the context of long-term retreats. If you're Tibetan, and you want to meditate, you go into a long-term retreat. That's always been how it works. Such a retreat can last for a year, 3 years, 10 years, or longer. We have examples of men and women throughout Tibetan history who take a vow to remain in retreat for the remainder of their lives. These retreats can be done individually, in a cave, or in a communal setting in a cloister, where you are locked away from the rest of the world alongside with a group of peers. No other form of Buddhism has put such a strong emphasis on the importance of practicing meditation in the context of retreat. This makes this a defining and distinctive feature of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, we know a great deal about the lives and legacies of certain important Tibetan meditators from throughout history, yogins, but there is yet to be any kind of systematic study of the culture of meditation out of which they arise. And that's the goal of this project. So the book is tentatively titled Mountain Dharma, The Culture of Meditation in Tibet. This project focuses on the norms and procedures for life in retreat as they've been prescribed by exegetes of the Tibetan tradition. Less so than the meditative practices that are undertaken, which I feel like are actually quite well known by us now. I'm more interested in the daily ins and outs of retreat, those practices, procedures, relationships, and norms that structure the meditative and lifestyle of the individual undertaking the retreat. The systematic examination of these prescriptions concerning the quotidian aspects of the retreat endeavor reveals the different ways that the endeavor of retreat has been understood throughout its history, the way it's been defined. And based on that, I hope to sort of extract different ways in which the ascetic self has been conceptualized within the Tibetan tradition. My goal here is to tell something like an intellectual history of the retreat tradition over the last 1,000 years. I hope that this will form a small part of a broader genealogy of the Buddhist meditative self that I believe that we as a field should be undertaking as a complement to the sort of advances that are happening in the more scientific study of meditation. Part 3, my sources. The source material for this project is 20-something Tibetan Buddhist manuals for meditative retreat written between the 12th century and the arrival of the Chinese in the middle of the 20th century. I've distributed a list that outlines some of the texts I'm working with. They're organized chronologically by author. These texts range from just a few pages long to more than 800 pages long. Some of them are sort of pithy evocations, trying to encourage the retreatant, while others are systematic explanations of everything that the retreatant might need to know in the course of this experience. The more detailed of these texts talk about such issues as how to choose a location for your retreat, how to get the food that will sustain you during your retreat, how to resolve doubts, how to deal with threats and bandits and harmful spirits, how to deal with lice and bedbugs, how to overcome illness, and how to determine whether or not you've actually achieved enlightenment. So some of the more extensive retreat manuals cover questions like these. Most of these retreat manuals, whether short or long, include the term Richa, which means Mountain Dharma. Here, Richa, Mountain Dharma, functions as a term of art, as a way of referring to retreat. In this usage, mountain evokes wild, uncivilized spaces. Mountains are also the home of the gods, and places of purity and power. By aligning themselves with the quote-unquote Mountain Dharma, masters of this tradition emphasize their withdrawal from the conventional world, compared to the ordinary majority of monks who live in relative comfort in monasteries near villages down below. Here, mountain indicates the taking of a second renunciation. First renunciation being that from layperson to cleric, and then there being a second renunciation as you distinguish yourself as a true ascetic from the wider body of monks and nuns. This is directly comparable to the forest monk tradition of South and Southeast Asia, and perhaps also the desert fathers of Christian monasticism. We see here as these people associating themselves with an uncivilized space, which they use as a sort of badge of honor to distinguish themselves from other clerics. The majority of the texts that I'm working with are presented as advice or instructions for retreatants in general, which can be applied to anyone undertaking this endeavor. Others of these texts are actually jayik, or sort of like constitution texts, or sort of outlines for how a specific meditative community is meant to function. So there's a little bit of variation among the ones that you're looking at. Nevertheless, all of these texts are prescriptive. They do not tell us how actually life in retreat was lived, but they give us idealized visions of how retreat is supposed to happen in the minds of the authors that span that 800-year period. Thus, this project is something like an intellectual history. Not an intellectual history of the tradition of the grand monasteries, but of hermits living in caves who are concerned with a very different set of issues. All right, now getting into the main part of my presentation. This book will attempt to tell a history of long-term meditative retreat in Tibet through an examination and a comparison of the respective ways in which these manuals instruct the meditator to negotiate 5 different facets of life in retreat: place, community, the lineage, the body, and as I will be addressing today, the question of food. In each of these chapters, the method I employ is to isolate and compare the different ways these authors conceive of the problems that might arise regarding each of these concerns that may impact life in retreat. Revealing what these individual authors understand to be potential problems in these different domains and the solutions they offer to those problems brings into relief their specific understandings of the retreat endeavor. In this way, we can systematically study this tradition of intensive interiority from the outside. This is similar to the method employed by Foucault in the 2nd volume of the History of Sexuality, which he refers to as problematization, which is paying attention to the way in which something is problematized. This is a hermeneutic that brings into relief specific technologies of the self, which is an idea I'm using to frame my entire project. Any conversation about long-term meditative retreat in Tibet must begin with the 11th century figure Milarepa, the Tibetan yogin par excellence, whose biography is among the best known narratives in the Tibetan world. Milarepa remains notable for his distinctive iconography. He is depicted as being green, which speaks to his singular achievement as a meditator. The story is that Milarepa's skin turned green as a result of his consumption of wild nettles during his meditative retreats in the southern parts of the Himalayan range. In fact, Milarepa's entire story, from childhood to liberation to death, is told through his changing relationship with food, a brief summary of which provides a starting point for our consideration of the retreat tradition's varying ways of problematizing food. According to the 1488 version of Milarepa's biography, written by the madman of Dzong, who was the primary subject of my presentation here in 2012, when he was a child, after his inheritance was stolen by his greedy aunt and uncle, and he was reduced to servitude, Milarepa tells how, quote, "our food was food for dogs." Then, when he began to study with religious teachers, his mother had to sell a plot of farmland in order to be able to buy provisions for him. When Milarepa is finally accepted as a disciple of his guru Marpa, he goes on a begging expedition. Upon his return with a sack of barley flour, exhausted, he drops the bag to the floor, which makes the house shake. This causes the erratic guru Marpa to scold Milarepa, asking if he's trying to knock the house down and kill them all. The story could not be more clear on the matter. For the unenlightened, food is a burden. The basic need to eat is a tie that binds us to worldly concerns and defines our suffering human existence. Once Milarepa finally receives tantric initiation and begins to meditate and retreat, the length of time he can remain in his cave is limited by the amount of food that he has brought with him. Years go by, and when Milarepa finally has absolutely nothing left to eat, he is faced with the question, whether or not to go down to the village to beg. This is when he begins eating nettles, which eventually imparts his skin with a greenish hue. Subsequent to Milarepa's transformation, when hunters find Milarepa in his cave, they are surprised by his appearance, exclaiming, "He's a ghost." By adopting this lifestyle, Milarepa has become something non-human. Later, some other hungry hunters arrive and in search of food. They state their willingness to eat whatever Milarepa does. So Milarepa instructs them to build a fire to boil some nettle stew. For meat, they must add more nettles. For the flour, more nettles. For the salt, even more nettles still. Through his extreme asceticism, Milarepa achieves something unique in the history of Buddhism in Tibet. He is regarded as having surpassed humanity to become a second Buddha. The greenish hue of his skin, making him easily identifiable in tankas to this very day, reminds everyone of the story of how this became so. Before his enlightenment and after, Milarepa's status is expressed through his relationship to food. As I will now show, What we find in less idealized representations of the yogic endeavor is that exegetes of the tradition also regard bodily nourishment as an issue of critical importance for the retreatant, although where it is that they locate its being problematic varies significantly. Before that, let me return to the line that provides the title for my talk today, Food Will Roll Uphill. This comes from an old Tibetan proverb which goes, Chöpa rila gomna, zengon gendu drill. When practitioners meditate in mountains, food will roll uphill. The existence of this saying reflects a popular sensitivity among Tibetans concerning the pragmatic concerns of life in meditative retreat. It also shows an awareness among the laity of the sociological structures that form to meet those concerns. A study of Tibetan lay perceptions of the tradition of retreat, including criticisms of the endeavor of retreat, would be a welcome contribution to the field, but that is not what the current project aims to do. What I'd like to do in the main part of my talk now is to consider the treatment of food from the perspective of the yogin's own tradition, the Chöpa of the adage, as expressed by 4 different manuals for life in meditative retreat. While Milarepa has remained an inspiration to later generations of meditators, representing an ideal to strive for, in practice, for mere mortals who have not yet transcended the need to eat during their retreats, how are they to negotiate this concern? What are the ideologies and practices that structure the relationship between the retreatant and food? What meanings does food have in this ascetic subculture? These questions can be isolated by considering what problems food is believed to cause and what strategies are prescribed for solving those problems. The first manual for retreat that I'd like to present is by the 3rd author on the list. This is the most influential retreat manual for Tibetan religion in the pre-modern world, Richa Yonten Kunjungwa Rinpoche Barwa Dangtenta, the blazing jewel, the Mountain Dharma that is the source of all good qualities, with its appendix, written by Yangompa Gyaltsen Pel of the Kagyu tradition. Yangompa's Mountain Dharma offers one of the most complete and systematic descriptions of the retreat endeavor ever written, and is therefore a central source for my study. The text proceeds from what qualities the potential retreat candidate should exemplify, to how to find a suitable cave or a hut, to the preliminary practices, instructions on the main yogic practices, which is the 6 yogas of Naropa and the Mahamudra, how to remove obstacles to spiritual practice, and finally, the personal manifestation of enlightenment. The text is something of a step-by-step how-to for the endeavor of retreat. This is in contrast to other texts which are more like compendia of instructions, or perhaps more meant to inspire than to instruct. Throughout Mountain Dharma, Yangompa treats food as an object of suspicion. The overwhelming majority of references to food in this text pertain to its being potentially a cause of problems within the psychosomatic continuum of the meditator. During periods when one is focusing on tumo visualization, food may be the cause of a lack of clarity, or a weakening of the drops. If one experiences setbacks in sexual yoga, he should attend more closely to what he eats. In the section on dealing with obstacles that arise within the body, Yangompa refers to how we can become ill thanks to the consumption of food. Yangompa also refers to food more positively in at least one place. If one's progress towards enlightenment has stalled, perhaps you should eat a little bit more. For Yangompa, food is a concern for the way it affects the experiential and meditative outcomes for the retreatant. The plane on which Yangompa regards sustenance as a concern is confined to the internal psychosomatic being of the meditator. Food being problematized in this way, Yangompa offers a solution to the problem of sustenance that is also operative on the level of the practitioner's own continuum, a practice referred to as the Yoga of Eating Zen. This is an internalized Homa practice, begins with visualizing a fire inside of oneself, which is fed with wood and stoked. As the food is swallowed and ingested, it is purified by the fire. Then as the practitioner continues to eat, he imagines the food as being offered to the deities, as purifying the obscurations of all sentient beings, as a means to end hunger and thirst throughout the universe. He should visualize himself in the form of his tutelary deity, with a spoon in its hand, and as he eats, the food travels down to satisfy the Lama visualized as residing in his heart, the tutelary deity in his belly, and the heroes and dakinis that reside in the 3 channels. The yoga of eating is like a series of meditative practices all performed at the same time. It is a way to purify the food being eaten in order to prevent it from potentially becoming a cause of obscuration in the ways alluded to throughout Yangompa's retreat manual. As is stated in the corresponding section of the commentarial appendix, quote, "Eating this food will sustain your life and nourish your body. Therefore, this is a critical moment in determining whether the outcomes will be good or bad." For Yangompa, the moment of consuming food is a critical inflection point. As Yangompa understands it, the food and its solution are internal concerns. In his description of the yoga of eating, Yangompa instructs the meditator to generate the thought that the food he is consuming will dispel the hunger of all sentient beings, about which Yangompa states, "Whether the disciples or the patrons get happiness or not, all depends on this. If the practice is done properly, eating is thus transmuted into a compassionate act." What I'm particularly interested in here is the reference to, quote, "patrons and disciples." This brief statement is in fact the only place in the entirety of the Mountain Dharma where Yangompa makes any allusion to how it is that the retreatant is supplied with food in the course of his retreat. It seems that Yangompa understands the retreatant as having an obligation to his material benefactors, but offers no further insight into how he understands this relation or how the exchange between retreatant and patron was established in the first place. As I will now show, some later authors of the retreat manuals saw fit to problematize food more on that level, not in terms of what goes on inside the meditator's physical being, but rather how the need to eat food forces the retreatant into relations with other persons, which can threaten the very retreat endeavor. These prescriptions will be seen as engendering a different kind of subjectivity for the meditator. My next example is from the sixth author on the list, Ri Chirtam Kuduzanko Drayang, or The Sweet Sound of the Mountain Dharma Teachings, Producing Nothing But Good, which is composed by Lekshe Drayang of the Zormang Kagyu in Nangchen Kham. While Yangompa is extremely famous and central to his lineage, Zormang Lekshe Drayang is relatively unknown. In the course of The Sweet Sound of Mountain Dharma Teachings, Lekshe Drayang makes absolutely no reference to the consumption of food as a potential cause of problems to one's meditation or one's body, as Yangompa had. Instead, Lekshe Drayang's particular problematization of food strictly concerns the questions of how to acquire it. Lekshe Drayang devotes one of his 12 chapters to the issue of food. From start to finish, the chapter is framed as a question of how the retreatant is or is not to acquire that sustenance, or perhaps how to transcend that need entirely. Zormang Lekshe Drayang states baldly that there are three options for how to sustain oneself during retreat. First, by using the alchemical practice of julen, the extraction of essences. Second, by begging from the laity. Or third, in a way that is completely unacceptable, which is to rely on other retreatants. The best of these three possibilities is to abide by the extraction of essences, which refers to a number of related practices by which one is ideally able to sustain oneself bodily without relying on ordinary, human, socially produced foods. Instead, one extracts len, the essence ju, out of material substances, ranging from extremely mundane things like pebbles to very rare things like flowers and herbs, which imbue one with powers. Through this alchemical process, one can live off potencies derived from ordinary things. Zormang Lekshe Drayang characterizes the practitioner who may live off the extractions of essences as follows. There's an authentic individual with faith who mainly practices the channels, winds, and drops of tantric yoga, who has experience in the practice of removing obstacles, who has completely cut off attachment to worldly food. For the sake of never descending into the village, one such as this employs the esoteric instruction of the extraction of essences for his livelihood. Lekshe Drayang asserts that there are more than 20 different ways of doing the extraction of essences, but limits his discussion to 5 of them, which are all based on the transmutation of ordinary foodstuffs into something more powerful. The materials he talks about are tsampa, alcohol, yogurt, tea, and molasses. For each of these 5, he lists a specific process of drying, boiling, grinding, mixing with other herbs, and the specific benefits that result from each one. For example, while consuming the empowered substance derived from tsampa is beneficial to one's samadhi, That which is produced from yogurt helps with the phlegm, among other, quote, inconceivable benefits. Zorman Lekshe Drayang concludes his section on essence instruction by characterizing this as a particularly difficult undertaking. There are few who know how to do it. It can be hard to get the right materials, and the processes for producing these substances must be done perfectly. Because of this, attempting to do Julen is likely to become a distraction for the meditator. Thus, it is simply better to go begging for one's food. Lekshe Drayang then turns his attention to providing instructions on the second of the three ways of sustaining himself, to go begging. Before breaking one's retreat to go begging for provisions, one must mentally don a protective helmet or armor, gocha, which creates a buffer between the meditator and the experiences he is soon to have, effectively insulating him from the world that he enters when leaving his retreat. 3 times the yogin is to generate the following thoughts. In going forth from my mountain retreat, I do so in order to maintain this physical body, which is practicing the holy Dharma. During this life, I am not looking for fame or renown or praise. And thus when I go into the village, if there are unwise people pretending to be wise, or bad people pretending to be good, or unaccomplished people pretending to be accomplished, I will not engage in talkativeness. Nor will I talk about dreams or give prognostications or talk about my meditation practices. From among this village or these nomads, I will gather provisions sufficient to sustain me for a period of months or weeks, then I will go immediately back to my retreat. I don't need to perform ceremonies and rituals. I will only be gone for a few days. In particular, so as not to accumulate the 10 non-virtues, I will not have any enmity towards the families who do not give me alms, nor will I have any attachment or praise for a patron who takes especially good care of me. From here, Lekshe Drayang explains how traveling itself provides an opportunity to practice the Mahamudra, through which all experiences while outside of the retreat, tiredness, the time of day, darkness or wind, rain or snow, water, dangerous passes, are all rendered neutral through meditative practice. One can also use these physical trials as an opportunity to improve one's control of the channels and winds, or do the illusory body or bardo practice, or to simply practice taking experiences onto the meditative path. Lekshe Drayang next offers a series of directives for how the yogin should interact with the laity from whom he begs. While out begging, the yogin is to keep his behavior in line with the dictates of the Vinaya in order to preserve the faith of potential donors. He can beg from specific households, but should not engage them in conversation or ask them about themselves. He should bless each household, regardless of whether or not he receives anything from them. Finally, Zorman Lekshe Drayang describes the third possible way of relating to food during retreat, which is to have no plan in this regard. Yogins like this become burdens to other retreatants. He quotes the famous yogin or Gempa, who describes certain renunciants, Chadril, who have taken the rhetoric of total renunciation, Gunbang, a bit too literally. If they think to go begging, they have no shoes to wear and no bag to carry that which they receive. In their cave, they have no wood for a fire, nor a pan for cooking. One like this may boast about the depths of his renunciation, but in fact he will end up relying on his Dharma brothers for all those things, which will divert them from their meditation. In the sweet sound of the Mountain Dharma teachings, Zorman Lekshe Drayang's way of problematizing the issue of food and his proposed solutions to that problem have the effect of characterizing the endeavor of retreat in a manner very different from Yangompa. Whereas for Yangompa, the question of how to get food was left entirely off the retreatant's radar, Lekshe Drayang, writing 300 years later, takes a very different, highly pragmatic approach. The attitude exemplified by Yangompa seems to be exactly the sort of thing that Lekshe Drayang has issued a warning against. Lekshe Drayang's approach entails a redrawing of the boundary of retreat and recasts the subjectivity of the retreatant by now characterizing him as an inevitably social being. The pragmatic attitude toward the collection of alms exemplified by Zorman Lekshe Drayang is found expressed in the majority of the retreat manuals that I have read. The ideal of getting entirely off the grid, whether through the extraction of essences or living off nettles, is regularly mentioned as perhaps having been possible in a different world age, but as no longer being possible in the time that we live. I found probably a dozen different retreat manuals that all say the same basic thing. To paraphrase one of these examples, from the 16th author on the list, Tenzin Norbu, he writes in his Jayik Nichir Sheldam, the Charter, Advice on the Mountain Dharma, which is dated to 1914, as follows. The time for taking on an asceticism that renounces all activities of this life has passed, which makes doing so difficult for us. But the time has not passed for living from begging and being itinerant. It is difficult currently to expend the entirety of one's life wandering only in the mountains like a rhinoceros. But whether you are staying in a monastery, a holy site, or a mountain retreat, you should renounce family, intimate associations, and animosities. According to Ngawang Tenzin Norbu, although on account of how the world has changed, it may not be possible externally to live up to the perfect ideal of retreat, we can nevertheless preserve the integrity of the retreat by keeping the right mindset. The last example I will talk about briefly is the Newem Pardepe Cherdze Tadak La Niwar Kue Richer Mutitu Changwa. The garland of pearls, the mountain dharma requisite for all dharma practitioners staying in isolation, by Drakar Losang Pelden, which is the 15th text listed, number 15. In his particular manner of problematizing the issue of sustenance during retreat, a great deal of attention is placed on the issue of where the boundaries of the retreat are drawn, not because of the meditator's leaving his retreat, but because of the world coming to him. Throughout the Garland of Pearls, Drakar Losang Pelden is fixated on the issue of the retreat and severing ties with family and other relations. In his presentation, renunciation is a central, persistent problem as the outside world arrives again and again at the yogin's doorstep. To mitigate this problem, Losang Pelden gives detailed instructions on how to act toward those who bring provisions or gifts. One should speak to them only enough to be polite, but not get into extended conversations. One method for dealing with local patrons, Losang Pelden suggests, is to pretend to be insane, after which people will arrive, quote, less and less. Losang Pelden gives a variety of prescriptions about how to negotiate relationships with non-retreatants. With permission from the Lama, family members may be allowed inside your retreat. Depending on how far they've come, they may even be able to spend the night. Drakar Losang Pelden writes about how clerics sometimes use flattery and manipulation to get patrons to give them things and lists the evils of doing so. He also discourages performing rituals for payment, which is a slippery slope towards worldly entanglements. There is much that is held in common between Zormang Leshe Dryan's and Drakar Losang Pelden's respective treatments of the issue of how the retreatant is to attain his sustenance. He will live from alms, which necessitates interacting with the laity. This in turn necessitates a set of prescriptions for how to manage those relationships. But whereas for Zormang Leshe Dryan it was the retreatant going out among villagers or nomads to collect, for Drakar Losang Pelden, writing about 300 years later, it is more often the case that patrons will come to the retreatant. Between Yangompa's, Zormang Leshe Dryan's, and Drakar Losang Pelden's accounts, we see reflections of different sociological realities that give a different shape to the retreat endeavor. These three manuals show how the material circumstances of retreat have changed, as indicated by what their respective authors understand to be the horizon of possibility for removing oneself from the world. So what I presented today, I hope, gives you a taste of the sorts of questions that I'm interested in for this project. In addition to this chapter on food, there's going to be a chapter on body, a chapter on place, a chapter on how to relate to other retreatants, and a chapter on, I think, how to relate to the lineage itself. So I'm interested in looking at how these different authors conceive of potential problems, how they prescribe solutions to them, and based on that, I hope to tell something of a history of this tradition from the inside. So this project is textual, it's historical, it tells a sort of diachronic story about this issue. I'm also engaged in, for my next project, a study of meditative retreat in the world today. This is a comparative study in a synchronic dimension. So this project I'm only in the early stages of, and this project focuses specifically on the 3-year, 3-month practice of retreat. The goal for this book is, over the course of 4 chapters, to write studies of how the 3-year, 3-month retreat is currently being undertaken in 4 different locations. in Tibetan cultural areas of China, among Tibetan exile communities in India, in France, and in the United States. So I'm going to take one practice with ostensibly the same goals, drawn from the same tradition, based on the same guru. Kalu Rinpoche was the one who spread this throughout all these places, and yet try and understand the different meanings associated with this practice among these different communities, the way it's adapted. This is all intended as a study of Buddhist modernism, sort of how Buddhist modernism is taking shape around us. This 3-year, 3-month retreat is, from my perspective, surprising how important it still is, how potent this is as an undertaking that people, even in the West, want to undertake. So I've only done a little bit of the initial work on this. I did a little bit of research at a retreat center in France last summer, which I'll talk a little bit now. This is the retreat center in Auvergne, connected to the monastery in Dordogne. This retreat center was established in 1984, at which time there was 18 men and women taking the retreat in a single farmhouse. By 1987, they had built separate quarters for men and women, and today there's 10 separate retreat cloisters, where up to 100 people could be doing the 3-year, 3-month retreat at the same time. They estimate that some 500 people have done retreats there since they founded the place. So this is the hub, this is the most important place for long-term meditative retreat for all of Europe. So what I'm interested in is how they negotiate this new context. These are men and women who don't know Tibetan, who have often a limited understanding of the rituals and the meditation practices that they're undertaking. So I'm interested in how these things change when the practice is brought to a new place. For example, to have some continuity with what I've been talking about, the question of how they sustain themselves. In the West, as men and women in the US and France and other places undertake these retreats, it's often advertised to them that they need $36,000 to support the retreat. The question is, where do they get that money? Some people have had Kickstarter campaigns. Some people have set up donation on a subscription models from friends and family who donate 50 euros a month via their credit cards. There's even a scholarship for this by the US-based Sadra Foundation, which I think is just something, I don't understand it, but there's something significant about that in terms of the Protestantizing of Buddhist practice in the US. So what we see is that it takes a village to support a meditator, but now it's a global village rather than a local one. So I'm curious in how, as these relationships are reconfigured for a new context, perhaps new meanings are given to meditation, and the retreat practice, which seems on the outside to be the same thing, actually means something quite different. Part of this project will be focusing on the current state of 3-year, 3-month retreat in Tibet, where it is, I think, surprisingly still very much a thing. There's a particular Lama named Wangchen Rinpoche, who lives in Los Angeles but has a monastery in Ganze, who's planning to build 108 new 3-year, 3-month retreat centers, if he can get the funding mainly from Chinese donors. So this is a huge part of the Buddhist revival that's taking place in China, and part of this project is to sort of get a pulse on that and compare that to these other places. So I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to hear people's comments, answer questions, and so on about my current project or my other current project.